Welcome, and thanks for listening to Cherry Bekaert's Not-for-Profit podcast series. In each episode, we hear from the best in the business on the latest challenges, trends, and opportunities affecting not-for-profit organizations and educational institutions. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening.
Welcome, everyone, to another not-for-profit podcast in Cherry Bekaert's Not-for-Profit Industry podcast series. My name is Melanie McPeak, Managing Director and Tax Leader of our not-for-profit industry. And joining me today is Tahira Nagda. Tahira is a Managing Director in our international tax practice. Welcome.
Thank you.
So today I'd like to talk about getting it right. And it's around the Form 1042 compliance for payments to foreign students and scholars. So Tahira, my question to you is, what is Form 1042 and why should universities specifically care?
So that's a great question, Melanie. Form 1042 is essentially a U.S. withholding tax return, and it's for payments made to foreign persons. Now, if a university makes certain payments to non-resident aliens, including for like scholarships, stipends, research payments, or honoraria, essentially the university is acting as a withholding agent, and they may be required to, withhold federal tax, deposit the tax timely to the IRS, and essentially, follow through with the reporting requirements on Form 1042 and 1042S and T. Now, if they, from a why should universities care? If they fail to report this, it can result in penalties, interest, and reputational risk. Whether the student owes tax or does not owe tax, the university can be on the hook as they are the withholding agent in this case.
Oh, goodness. So let's make sure the universities understand some of these definitions. So who is considered a foreign person for Form 1042 purposes?
Sure, yeah. So from a university's perspective, a foreign person would typically include non-resident alien students, visiting professors, researchers, or postdoctoral students, and they're foreign nationals on a variety of visas, such as F1, J1, M1, O1, TN, or B1, B2 visas. And this residency is determined for tax purposes, and it's not necessarily specific to immigration rules. And it depends on the substantial presence test, and the visa status also matters to classify an individual as a foreign person.
So what I'm hearing is it's extremely important for the universities themselves to gather this detail to determine whether or not the Form 1042 is a requirement. And then as we'll go further into what those requirements are, making sure that the compliance is in fact complete and accurate.
That's right. Yeah. There's some due diligence required on the university's part to be able to gather all that data, to ensure that they're accurately reporting for compliance purposes.
All right, so let's take it step by step, I guess. So are scholarships to foreign students always taxable, or are there different varieties and different tax treatments with those varieties?
And that's a great question, Melanie. With respect to scholarships, not the entire amount is taxable, generally speaking. So the portion of scholarship that's not taxable is the actual tuition portion, right? The tuition fees, right? That's generally not taxable. Your books and supplies are generally not taxable. But if part of your scholarship applies to room, board, travel, or stipends, or if you have cash scholarships, those could be taxable, right? And that taxable portion is what's reported on for compliance purposes on the 1042 S's and T's, as well as the Form 1042. And they may be subject to withholding at 14%.
Ooh, 14%. That's an odd percentage for withholding. So why is that so common for students?
So again, with respect to the IRS rules, yeah, the 14% looks odd. But the the reason the IRS has kind of come up with this is, generally speaking, you would think about a 30% rate. It's sort of halfway there. They have 14% withholding for scholarships that you have paid to F1, J1, M1, and Q visa holders. Unless now there is a way you could get out of the withholding if there's a tax treaty exemption that applies, or if the payment qualifies entirely as non-taxable education assistance. So there are, yes, you have generally speaking at 14%, but there are carve-outs to getting potentially a reduced rate.
Boy, now we're talking tax treaties. So it's a good thing that professionals such as yourself understand these rules and the complexity around these reportings in order to help out universities and colleges with this compliance exercise. So with that, how do the tax treaties affect the Form 1042 compliance?
So I want to step back a little bit here and kind of have a general overview of what tax treaties are, right? These are bilateral agreements between two countries that kind of agree to having a different treatment for tax purposes for their residents with respect to income from another country. And, the United States has various treaties with different countries that can reduce sort of the tax burden on those individuals living abroad or individuals from other countries who are living in the U.S. So an overview of what tax treaties are. Now, with respect to 1042 compliance and scholarships and so on, how that would impact the universities as well as the students, you can, with the tax treaty, you may either be exempt from withholding for all or part of scholarships, stipends or honoraria. And it may reduce your withholding tax rate or eliminate the withholding completely. Now, one thing to note here is that treaty benefits are not automatic, right? So that's something to keep in mind. There is a little bit more work required with respect to that.
And I have a feeling there's additional forms that are likely required. So what type of documentation is required to apply a tax treaty?
So typically you would expect to receive a W-8 Ben. So the university would expect a W-8 Ben from the student saying that, hey, we've looked at the rules and we know this particular jurisdictional treaty applies and we meet the benefits of that treaty, and this is the documentation that shows that we're either exempt or a reduced rate applies, right? The other form that you might receive is Form 8233. That's for services or honoraria to show documentation. There's also an aspect, from a university has to keep on file visa status verification and an identification number of some sort. So foreign taxpayer identification number or social security number or an ITIN, that's something that's often required. Now, without valid documentation, so if you don't have this documentation on file for the recipients of any sort of payments, you as the university who's the withholding agent is required to withhold at full rates and cannot get a reduced rate withholding. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You need to ensure that this documentation is present in your files if you are claiming a reduced rate.
So can you repeat again the full withholding rate versus the reduced withholding rate?
Right. So as we talked about a little bit ago, depending on, again, we might go into this a little bit more in detail, but for scholarships, for example, right, there's the 14% withholding rate. And there may be cases where you may have to withhold 30% depending on the nature of the payment. So it's either 30% or 14% depending on the nature of the payment. Reduced rate would be potentially eliminating it overall to 0%, right? And that's kind of the difference. And it could be a substantial amount from the university's perspective in terms of how much they would have to withhold and remit to the IRS.
And that I feel is important for our listeners and our university and colleges to know, is that substantial amount versus, full versus the reduced rate. So thank you for that clarification and additional information.
Sure.
Now, speaking with you offline, prior to this podcast, I was not aware that honoraria paid to foreign speakers, for example, was treated differently than students and scholarship recipients. Can you speak to those differences?
Sure, yeah. So honoraria are generally considered compensation for services, right? And so unlike scholarships, they actually are subject to 30% withholding unless if they're reduced by, again, some sort of treaty, right? And you have the proper documentation to claim that treaty rate. The reporting, just like scholarships and other payments to non-residents, is again on 1042 S's and T's and Form 1042 itself as well. And so that rate differential exists for honoraria simply because the treatment that the IRS has for those types of payments is different from that of scholarships. Now, special rules do apply for B1, B2 academic activity honoraria, but the limits with respect to that must be carefully tracked by the universities.
So I keep hearing the common theme that we in the nonprofit industry hear regularly. It's document, 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 and keep on file in case anything is questioned for any type of compliance reporting.
That's right. Yeah. I cannot stress enough how much how far documentation can take you in terms of any sort of potential IRS audits and so on, right? Being able to support the position that you have.
So what's the difference between a stipend and a wage?
So that's a little tough in that the IRS does not necessarily go by what the payments are called, right? If it's called a stipend or if it's called a wage, they go by the underlying nature of the payment or the reason behind the payment, right? So let's say if you're providing training or education support, right? The likely treatment by the IRS would be a scholarship or fellowship there. If, however, your purpose is to teach or provide research services, those would be actual wages reported on Form W-2. If, however, you're providing some sort of independent activity, right, those would be considered honorarium, any payments for that, and reported accordingly. One of the biggest issues we see is sort of this misclassification of, the services being provided and how they're classified for withholding tax purposes or reporting compliance purposes, right? And that's in higher education. That's one of the biggest audit triggers that we would see, a misclassification of payments and the background behind what the purpose of the payments was and how colleges and universities are reporting those.
And speaking of, common audit issues in higher education, this item, the Form 1042 reporting, is included and has been included for a few years now, the IRS's priority items for compliance matters and review. Do you want to elaborate any further for our audience members and stress the importance of this compliance?
Sure, yes. So no doubt it's in the LB&I campaigns that the IRS has with respect to paying more attention to 1042, 1042 S&T compliance. They are looking at this a bit more closely. They are auditing institutions with respect to this. One of the things that wanted to point out here is, that yes, this is a compliance activity. It's not as fun, but it is equally important because this can, lack of compliance on this end cannot just, create issues with respect to penalties and interest for non-compliance, but it could be impacting your 501c3 status. It could be impacting your state licensing, because state licensing boards have the requirement to be in compliance with these forms and the obligations around that. So, and it's a reputational risk, frankly. So, I mean, there's a lot of aspects to a simple task of compliance on federal forms, right? But the impact to non-compliance can be substantial for our higher education institutions. Which is why I think I wanted to stress that's something that needs to be looked at. If there are processes that need to be put in place and so on, those need to be rectified so that the universities and colleges can be in compliance with this reporting.
And we know tax exempt status revocation is probably worst case scenario, but from what I understand, just the penalties and interest of noncompliance in this area could be expensive.
That's right. Yeah, they start off small, but they can be add up very quickly because they are on a monthly basis, and so they can add up pretty quickly. And then penalties and interest with respect to not actually making the tax deposits can add up to be fairly substantial.
Well, I think, Tahira, our next podcast should be to review the reporting obligations and best practices surrounding this compliance exercise. If you agree, I would be happy to join you once again in this topic of 1042 reporting.
That would be awesome, Melanie, and looking forward to the next podcast.
To learn more about how Cherry Bekaert's not-for-profit and international tax teams can help your organization navigate these complex issues, visit cbh.com or reach out to Tahira or me through the links included in the episode notes. Thanks again for listening.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to our next one. Don't forget to subscribe.